The night I kissed Damien Cross. The music in the bar didn't stop, but somehow the entire room still went silent. At least, that's how it felt in my memory. The bass was still thumping through the floorboards, neon lights still flickering over the rows of whiskey bottles, and people were still laughing somewhere behind me. But for a few seconds it was like the world had narrowed down to just one thing. The man sitting alone in the corner booth and the terrible dare I had just agreed to. It had started the way stupid bar stories always start, with friends, cheap cocktails, and someone saying, "You won't do it." My best friend Marissa leaned across the sticky wooden table with that mischievous grin she always wore when trouble was about to happen. "Truth or dare, Lila?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "Dare," I said, because it had been a long week, and because sometimes saying yes felt easier than thinking too much. Marissa turned in her seat and scanned the crowded bar until her eyes landed on the darkest corner of the room. "See that guy?" she said quietly, pointing with her glass. I followed her gaze. He was sitting alone beneath a dim amber light, wearing a black suit that looked too expensive for a place like this. His posture was straight, almost military, one hand resting near a glass of whiskey he barely seemed to touch. Dark hair, sharp jaw, the kind of calm expression that made him look like he didn't belong to the chaos around him. "Go kiss him," Marissa said, trying not to laugh. "One kiss. Then come right back." I stared at her. "You're kidding. You said dare." My other friends burst into laughter, chanting my name like a bunch of middle schoolers who had somehow snuck into a Manhattan bar. I looked back toward the man. He hadn't moved, hadn't smiled, hadn't even looked up from the quiet stillness he seemed wrapped in. For a second I thought about refusing. But pride is a dangerous thing when mixed with tequila. "Fine," I muttered, pushing my chair back. The walk across the bar felt longer than it should have. My boots echoed softly against the wooden floor while the neon lights painted everything in shades of pink and blue. As I got closer, I noticed details I hadn't seen from the table. The subtle silver watch on his wrist, the crisp lines of his tailored jacket, the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need attention to own the room. He finally looked up when I stopped beside the booth. His eyes were darker than I expected. Calm, observant, like he was already trying to figure me out. For a moment, I almost forgot the dare. Then Marissa's voice echoed in my head. "You won't do it." So I leaned down before I could lose my nerve. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't passionate. Just a quick, nervous kiss against his cheek that brushed the corner of his mouth before I stepped back again. "Sorry," I said automatically, my heart pounding. It was a dare. I expected confusion. Maybe annoyance. Maybe even a laugh. Instead, the man studied me in complete silence. The music kept playing. Glasses clinked somewhere behind me. But his gaze didn't move. Then something strange happened. The bartender across the room stopped polishing a glass. Two men, near the door, suddenly straightened like they had been waiting for a signal. And the quiet man in the booth slowly reached out and closed his hand around my wrist. Not tightly, just enough to stop me from walking away. His voice was calm when he spoke. "Who told you?" he asked softly. "That was a game." For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. His hand was warm around my wrist, steady and deliberate, not rough, not hurried, but impossible to ignore. Up close, the man looked even more composed than he had from across the bar. The low amber light traced the sharp lines of his face and reflected faintly in his dark eyes, eyes that did not look amused or embarrassed or even irritated. They looked curious. "It was just a dare," I repeated quietly, forcing a small laugh that sounded thinner than I intended. "My friends are being idiots tonight." His gaze did not leave mine. The music behind us continued to pulse through the room, a deep rhythm that vibrated through the floor, yet the space around our booth still felt strangely quiet. He studied my face like he was trying to memorize something important. Then he released my wrist as calmly as he had taken it. I should have walked away immediately. That was the normal thing to do. Instead, I stood there for one more second, rubbing the place where his fingers had been, as if the question he had asked was still echoing against my skin. "I did not mean to interrupt your evening," I said, stepping back. "It was just supposed to be funny." The corner of his mouth moved slightly, not quite a smile, more like the shadow of one. "Nothing about that looked accidental," he said. His voice was quiet but clear, the kind of voice that made people lean in without realizing they were doing it. I suddenly became very aware of the room again. Two men standing near the entrance were watching us with the focused stillness of security guards. The bartender, who had been laughing with another customer minutes earlier, now kept glancing in our direction like he was waiting for something to happen. A strange pressure settled in my chest. "Trust me," I said, trying to lighten the moment. "If I had known you were going to take it that seriously, I would have picked someone else." That was when his expression finally changed. Not anger. Something sharper. Something thoughtful. He leaned back slightly in the booth, folding one arm along the back of the seat, as if the entire conversation belonged to him now. "That is the problem," he said calmly. "You did not know." I blinked. "Know what?" Instead of answering immediately, he reached for the glass of whiskey in front of him and lifted it slowly. He did not drink. He simply held it, the amber liquid catching the light between us. "Most people in this room know exactly who they are walking up to before they make that decision," he said. The words hung in the air longer than they should have. Something cold slipped down my spine. I opened my mouth to ask what he meant, but behind me, I suddenly heard Marissa calling my name from across the bar. "Lila." Her voice carried that urgent edge that only appeared when she realized a joke had gone too far. I turned my head just long enough to see her standing near our table, her expression somewhere between panic and disbelief. When I looked back at the man in the booth, he was still watching me with the same quiet intensity. "You should go back to your friends," he said. The tone was polite, but it felt less like permission and more like a decision already made. I nodded quickly, grateful for the escape. "Good night," I said. I took 2 steps away before something compelled me to glance back one last time. He had not moved. The glass of whiskey was still in his hand, untouched. And those calm, observant eyes were still following me as if the dare that had started this whole ridiculous moment was not over yet. I barely made it back to the table before Marissa grabbed my arm. "What did you do?" she whispered, her voice low but urgent. The rest of our friends had stopped laughing. Their eyes were fixed on me like I had just walked back from stepping into traffic. I frowned, still trying to shake off the strange calm of the man in the corner booth. I kissed him. That was the dare, remember? Marissa stared at me like I had completely lost my mind. "Lila, that is not the kind of guy you walk up to." I slid back into my chair, trying to brush it off. He seemed fine, quiet, maybe a little intense, but he did not exactly throw me out of the bar. No one at the table laughed. That was when I noticed the way people nearby were looking at us. Not openly staring, but glancing in quick, nervous flashes before looking away again. The bartender had stopped wiping glasses and was talking quietly with a man in a black jacket near the end of the counter. Even the music seemed lower than it had been 10 minutes earlier. I leaned closer to Marissa. "Okay, what is going on?" She looked over her shoulder toward the corner booth, then back at me. "Please tell me you did not say anything stupid." I told him it was a dare. "That is not what I mean." Her voice dropped even further. "Did you ask his name?" "No." "Did he tell you who he was?" I shook my head. Marissa closed her eyes like she was silently counting to 10. "Then listen to me very carefully," she said. "We are going to finish our drinks. We are going to leave, and we are going to pretend tonight never happened." The seriousness in her tone finally made my stomach tighten. "Why?" She hesitated for a moment, then leaned so close I could feel her breath near my ear. "Because that man is Damian Cross." The name meant nothing to me. I blinked. "Okay." And Marissa pulled back slowly, disbelief written across her face. "You seriously do not know who that is?" "Should I?" She looked around the bar again, clearly uncomfortable even saying the name out loud. "He owns half the places in this part of the city," she whispered. "Restaurants, clubs, security companies, things people do not talk about out loud." My pulse quickened slightly. "So he is some rich business guy?" That still does not explain why everyone is acting like I just broke a law. "Because people do not walk up and kiss Damian Cross," Marissa said quietly. "Especially not as a joke." I glanced back toward the corner of the bar before I could stop myself. He was still there. Still sitting exactly the same way, one arm resting along the back of the booth, the untouched glass of whiskey in front of him catching the neon reflections from the bar lights. From across the room his expression looked calm, almost detached. But the moment my eyes met his again, I realized something unsettling. He had never stopped watching me. Not once. My stomach dropped. I turned back to the table quickly. "Okay," I said under my breath. "Maybe we should leave." Marissa nodded immediately. "That is the smartest thing you have said all night." Chairs scraped softly against the floor as we gathered our things. I could feel the weight of that quiet gaze even while I stood up, like an invisible thread pulling my attention back toward the corner booth. We walked toward the exit together, trying to look casual even though every step felt strangely loud in my ears. Just before I reached the door, I glanced back one last time. Damian Cross was no longer holding his whiskey. Both of his hands were resting on the table now, and the calm, patient expression on his face looked less like curiosity and more like the beginning of a decision. The cool night air hit my face the second we stepped outside, and for the first time in the last 15 minutes, I felt like I could breathe again. The bar door closed behind us with a heavy thud, sealing the music and neon chaos back inside. The street was quieter, washed in the pale yellow glow of old streetlights and the distant hum of traffic moving through Manhattan. A few blocks away, Marissa grabbed my elbow and pulled me toward the curb like she expected the door to swing open again at any moment. "Do not look back," she said quickly. "Just keep walking." Naturally, that made me want to look back even more. I lasted about 3 seconds before curiosity won. I glanced over my shoulder at the bar entrance. The door was still closed. No one was following us. No dark, suited men stepping into the street. Nothing dramatic at all. Just the same quiet sidewalk and a taxi idling near the corner. "See," I said, letting out a nervous laugh. "We are fine." Marissa did not laugh. She kept walking, her heels tapping quickly against the pavement. "Lila, you do not understand the kind of attention you just invited." I shoved my hands into the pockets of my jacket and tried to sound calmer than I felt. "I kissed a guy on a dare. That is not exactly a federal crime." "You kissed Damian Cross," she said firmly. "That is the difference." We reached the edge of the block where a row of parked cars reflected the streetlights in dull silver streaks. A light breeze moved through the avenue, carrying the distant smell of food trucks and late-night traffic. Normally the city at midnight felt alive and comforting. Tonight it felt like the whole place was quietly watching. "You are making this sound way more dramatic than it is," I said. He barely reacted. Marissa stopped walking and turned to face me. Her expression was serious in a way I had only seen a few times before. "Exactly," she said. "That is the part that worries me." I frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means people like that do not react right away. They think first." The words settled somewhere deep in my stomach. I started to answer, but the bar door suddenly opened behind us. Both of us froze. A man stepped out onto the sidewalk, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket that looked a little too structured to be casual. He did not rush toward us. He simply stepped aside and lit a cigarette, glancing briefly down the street before leaning against the brick wall near the entrance. Marissa exhaled slowly. "Okay," she whispered. "That one is not coming for us." I turned away again, trying to ignore the strange tension curling through my chest. We continued walking toward the corner where the yellow glow of a traffic signal painted the pavement gold. A taxi rolled past slowly, its tires whispering against the asphalt. The whole city felt unusually quiet for a Friday night. "Look," I said after a minute. Nothing happened. He asked one question. I apologized. End of story. Marissa did not respond right away. Instead, she glanced behind us once more, then leaned closer, so only I could hear her voice. "You keep thinking tonight was the end of something," she said quietly. "But the way he looked at you back there?" I felt a chill run along my arms despite the warm summer air. "That was not the end." She paused, her eyes searching my face like she was deciding whether to say the rest out loud. "That looked like the beginning." I told myself Marissa was overreacting. That was the only explanation that made sense during the cab ride home. Manhattan slid past the window in streaks of yellow streetlights and blurred storefronts while the driver hummed quietly to the radio. The city looked the same as it always did at midnight, busy and alive. People crossing intersections, taxis honking, delivery trucks idling under glowing signs. Nothing about it suggested that a single stupid dare in a crowded bar could matter to anyone outside our table. By the time the cab stopped in front of my apartment building, the whole thing already felt smaller in my mind, like the kind of story friends laugh about the next day over coffee. I paid the driver, stepped out onto the sidewalk, and looked up at the familiar brick building that had been home for the last 3 years. A narrow walk up, chipped steps, a flickering porch light that the landlord never bothered to fix. Completely ordinary. Exactly the kind of place that had nothing to do with men in expensive suits sitting quietly in dark corner booths. Inside, The hallway smelled faintly of old paint and someone cooking pasta 2 floors above. I climbed the stairs, kicked off my boots the moment I reached my apartment, and dropped onto the couch with a long breath. Silence settled around me. No music. No neon lights. Just the distant hum of traffic outside my window and the soft ticking of the cheap wall clock above the kitchen counter. 4. A few minutes I sat there replaying the night in my head. The dare. The walk across the bar. The calm way Damien Cross had looked at me like he was trying to understand a puzzle. I shook my head and laughed quietly to myself. You kissed a stranger, I muttered. That is all. I grabbed a glass of water from the kitchen, checked my phone, and saw 3 new messages from Marissa already lighting up the screen. The first one said, "Are you home safe?" The second said, "Please promise me you will stay in tonight." The third simply said, "Do not answer unknown numbers." I rolled my eyes, typing back quickly. "I am home. Everything is fine. You are being dramatic." I tossed the phone onto the coffee table and turned on the television, letting the low murmur of late-night talk shows fill the room. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. The normal rhythm of the apartment slowly pulled my mind away from the strange tension of the bar. I was halfway through a bowl of cereal when my phone buzzed again against the table. I assumed it was Marissa continuing her lecture. Without thinking, I picked it up. The screen showed a number I did not recognize. No name. No contact photo. Just 10 unfamiliar digits glowing in the quiet room. For a moment I considered ignoring it. Marissa's warning flickered through my mind, followed immediately by my own stubborn curiosity. It was probably spam, or a wrong number, or someone from work. I tapped the message open. There was only one sentence. No greeting. No explanation. Just a single line of text that made my heart stop for a second. I hope you made it home safely, Lila Hayes. I stared at the screen. My name sat there in plain letters, perfectly spelled, perfectly calm. A cold feeling slid slowly down my spine. I had never told Damien Cross my name. Not once. I stared at the message long enough that the screen dimmed and went dark in my hand. When I tapped it awake again, the words were still there, calm and simple, like they belonged in a normal conversation. I hope you made it home safely, Lila Hayes. My apartment suddenly felt quieter than it had a moment ago. The television continued talking in the background, the host laughing with an audience somewhere in another studio across the city, but the sound felt distant now. I read the message again, slower this time. There was no signature. No explanation. Just my full name sitting at the end of that sentence like it had always belonged there. A slow, uneasy realization began to settle in my chest. I had never told him my name. I was sure of it. In the bar I had only said sorry. I had said it was a dare. That was it. My thumb hovered above the screen while a dozen thoughts rushed through my head. Maybe Marissa had said my name while calling me back to the table. Maybe someone in the bar had mentioned it. Maybe he had simply overheard. I tried to cling to the most ordinary explanation because the alternative felt much more unsettling. Finally, I opened my messages and typed the first thing that came to mind. Who is this? I watched the little gray bubble appear almost immediately, the way it does when someone is already holding their phone. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, then appeared again. My heartbeat began to pick up for reasons I could not fully explain. A second later the reply arrived. I think you already know. The calm tone of the sentence made the room feel colder somehow. I leaned back against the couch and exhaled slowly. Of course it was him. The quiet man in the corner booth with the untouched whiskey and the observant eyes. Damien Cross. I told myself to ignore the message. That was the smartest choice. Marissa had said exactly that. Do not answer unknown numbers. Pretend the whole night never happened. But curiosity has always been stronger than my common sense. My fingers moved across the screen before I could stop them. How did you get my number? The 3 dots appeared again. This time they stayed longer. I could almost picture him somewhere across the city, reading the question with that same thoughtful expression he had worn in the bar. The response finally arrived. Information moves very quickly in this city. I frowned at the screen. That was not really an answer. That sounded more like a statement someone made when they already knew far more than they were willing to explain. I glanced toward the dark window beside my couch. The glass reflected the soft glow of the apartment lights and the quiet outline of my living room. Everything looked normal. Safe. The way it had always looked. Yet a strange awareness had settled over me now, like invisible threads connecting the quiet apartment to the rest of the city outside. I typed one more message before I could overthink it. Why are you texting me? This time the pause lasted longer. Long enough that I thought maybe he had decided not to answer. Then the phone buzzed softly in my hand again. Because you walked up to a stranger tonight and changed the direction of his evening. I read the sentence twice, trying to decide whether it sounded amused or serious. Maybe both. Another message appeared immediately after the first. And because, Lila Hayes, I do not think you realized who you were daring. For a long moment, I did not reply. The phone rested in my hand while the quiet hum of my apartment wrapped around me again, but the words on the screen refused to feel ordinary. Because you walked up to a stranger tonight and changed the direction of his evening. And because, Lila Hayes, I do not think you realized who you were daring. I exhaled slowly and leaned my head back against the couch. The rational part of my mind tried to shrink the moment back down to something manageable. He was a wealthy man with connections. Of course he could find a phone number if he wanted to. New York City ran on information. Everything about everyone could be found somewhere if a person knew where to look. That explanation should have been comforting. Instead it made the quiet apartment feel strangely smaller. My phone buzzed lightly in my hand again, another message arriving before I had typed anything back. Silence usually means people are thinking too hard. A small, reluctant smile slipped across my face despite myself. His tone in text sounded exactly the way he had spoken in the bar, calm and observant, like he was watching reactions unfold rather than chasing them. I stared at the screen for a second longer before typing my response. You are right about one thing. I had no idea who you were. The three dots appeared immediately again. This time they disappeared almost as quickly as they came. The reply arrived a moment later. That much was obvious. I sat forward on the couch, resting my elbows on my knees while the soft glow of the phone lit the room around me. For someone Marissa described like a walking legend in the darker corners of the city, Damian Cross was surprisingly patient over text. No threats. No arrogance. Just quiet statements that somehow carried more weight than either of those things. I typed again. Then maybe we should both pretend tonight never happened. The message sent, and for the first time since the conversation began, the typing dots did not appear right away. A full minute passed. Then another. I stood up and walked toward the window, pulling the curtain aside to look out at the empty street below. A delivery truck rolled slowly past the building across the road, its headlights sweeping briefly across the sidewalk before disappearing around the corner. The city looked the same as it always had. Yet I could not shake the feeling that some invisible line had shifted somewhere tonight. My phone buzzed again in my hand. I looked down and read the message slowly. That would be the sensible solution. I waited, expecting the conversation to end there. Instead, another message appeared beneath it. I have learned that sensible decisions are not always the most interesting ones. I let out a quiet laugh under my breath. There was something strangely honest about that sentence. Dangerous, maybe, but honest. My fingers hovered over the screen while I decided how much of this conversation I was willing to continue. Finally, I typed the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind since the moment Marissa whispered his name outside the bar. Why were you sitting alone tonight? The reply came faster this time. Sometimes a person sits in a crowded room because it is the only place where no one expects anything from them. I read the sentence twice, surprised by the quiet weight behind it. Then another message followed. Until someone unexpected walks across the room and changes that plan. I stared at the glowing words while a slow, uneasy realization settled in my chest. The dare had lasted 5 seconds. The conversation that followed was starting to feel like it might last much longer. I stood by the window longer than I meant to, the curtain still half pulled aside while the city moved quietly below. A car passed at the end of the block, headlights sliding across the pavement like slow-moving water before fading into the distance. My phone rested in my hand, the last message from Damian Cross glowing softly against the dark screen. Until someone unexpected walks across the room and changes that plan. I should have ended the conversation there. Any reasonable person would have. Marissa's warning echoed faintly in the back of my mind again, telling me to close the phone, turn off the lights, and forget the entire strange chain of events that had started with a stupid dare. But curiosity had always been my weakness. And something about the calm rhythm of his messages made the conversation feel less like a threat and more like a puzzle I could not quite solve yet. I moved back to the couch and sat down slowly, staring at the screen while another thought formed in my mind. The man I had kissed in a crowded bar did not seem like someone who spent time exchanging quiet messages with strangers. People with reputations like his usually had assistants, schedules, rooms full of people waiting for their attention. Yet here he was, somewhere across the city, typing back almost as quickly as I could think of questions. My fingers moved before I could stop them. Are you always this patient with strangers? The reply arrived within seconds. Only with the ones who walk up and surprise me. I leaned back into the couch, letting out a small breath. Even through text, his tone carried that same calm confidence I remembered from the bar. No rush. No pressure. Just quiet certainty. I typed again. That was not exactly my plan tonight either. The typing dots appeared again, paused, then continued. Life tends to ignore people's plans. I studied the message for a moment, then asked the question that had been lingering in my mind since Marissa first said his name outside the bar. Do people usually leave you alone when you are sitting in public like that? The answer took longer this time. Long enough that I imagined him somewhere in the city, perhaps in the back seat of a car or in an office high above the streets, considering how much truth to send through a simple phone screen. When the message finally appeared, it was short. Usually they do not come close enough to try. A faint chill moved through me again. The way he said it did not sound arrogant. It sounded factual. I looked down at the screen again and typed slowly. Then I guess I was the exception. The reply came almost immediately. Yes, you were. I let the phone rest against my knee while the quiet apartment settled around me again. The television had switched to commercials I was no longer watching, and the clock on the wall ticked softly toward midnight. Another message appeared before I could decide whether to say anything else. There is something else you should know, Lila Hayes. My pulse quickened slightly. I straightened on the couch and waited for the next line to appear. It came a few seconds later. When people notice that you are connected to someone like me, they tend to start asking questions. I read the sentence twice, feeling the weight behind the calm words. Then a second message followed. Which means tonight may not stay as quiet as you hoped. I stared at the screen while a slow realization began to settle in my chest. The dare had lasted only a few seconds. But whatever came after it was only just beginning. The message stayed on my screen longer than I expected, the quiet weight of it settling somewhere deep in my chest. When people notice that you are connected to someone like me, they tend to start asking questions. Which means tonight may not stay as quiet as you hoped. I read the words again, slower this time, as if the meaning might soften if I gave it another second. It did not. Outside the window, the street looked exactly the same as it had 10 minutes earlier, calm and ordinary. A delivery van rumbling past the corner while a couple walked under the yellow glow of the streetlight. Nothing about the scene suggested that anything unusual had happened tonight. Yet his message made the entire city feel slightly different, like there were conversations happening in places I could not see. I lowered the phone slowly and leaned back against the couch, trying to decide how seriously I was supposed to take a warning from a man I had spoken to for less than 10 minutes in person. My practical side told me the whole thing was exaggerated. People in bars kiss strangers all the time. It was not exactly headline news. Still, the calm certainty in his tone made it difficult to dismiss completely. I lifted the phone again and typed carefully. I am not connected to you. It was a dare. That is all. The message sent, and for the first time since our conversation began, the reply did not come immediately. 30 seconds passed, then a full minute. I found myself watching the screen the way people watch a quiet elevator display, waiting for movement that might or might not come. Finally, the typing dots appeared. The response arrived a moment later. That may be how you see it. I frowned slightly. Another message appeared beneath it before I could respond. Other people will not see it that way. I rubbed my forehead slowly, letting out a small breath. The logic was frustratingly simple. In his world, appearances probably carried more weight than explanations. If people had seen me walk up to him in a crowded bar, if someone had recorded it or mentioned it somewhere, then the story would already be moving through circles I knew nothing about. The thought made the apartment feel unusually quiet again. I typed back. And what exactly do people think they saw? The answer arrived almost instantly this time. A woman who walked up to Damien Cross without hesitation. I stared at the screen. The words felt strange when they were written like that, as if the moment in the bar had been something far more deliberate than the truth. I typed again. They saw someone losing a bet with her friends. The typing dots appeared, then paused. When the next message arrived, It carried the same calm tone that had followed every sentence he sent. Intent does not always matter once a moment becomes public. I leaned back into the couch again, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen filling the silence for a second. It was a strange realization, thinking about how quickly a simple moment could become something else in the eyes of strangers. My phone buzzed once more before I could decide what to say next. For what it is worth, the message read, "I do not think you meant to involve yourself in anything complicated tonight." I let out a quiet breath. That part at least sounded accurate. A second message followed immediately after. But the city has a way of noticing things that were never meant to be important. I stared at the glowing words while a slow understanding began to settle in my chest. Somewhere out there, beyond the quiet walls of my apartment, people might already be talking about a moment that had lasted less than 5 seconds. I stayed on the couch long after the last message faded from the screen, the quiet hum of my apartment wrapping around me like a blanket that no longer felt completely safe. But eventually the conversation stopped. No more typing dots. No more calm sentences appearing out of nowhere. Just silence again. I placed the phone on the coffee table and tried to convince myself that the moment had ended there. The city outside continued its usual rhythm, taxis passing under streetlights, distant laughter drifting from somewhere down the block, a subway rumbling faintly beneath the pavement. Nothing about the world suggested that anything unusual had happened tonight. Yet sleep did not come easily. My mind kept replaying the same few seconds in the bar. The way the music had faded in my memory. The calm weight of Damien Cross's hand stopping me before I walked away. The quiet certainty in his voice when he asked that single question. Eventually exhaustion won. I must have fallen asleep sometime after 1 in the morning because the next thing I remember was sunlight spilling through the narrow gap in my curtains. Morning in Manhattan always arrived with a certain kind of energy, delivery trucks unloading boxes, neighbors walking dogs, the low buzz of the city waking up again. For a moment, everything felt normal. Then I remembered the messages. My eyes moved immediately to the coffee table where my phone still rested. The screen lit up the moment I picked it up. 3 new notifications waited there. One from Marissa, one from my work group chat, and one from an unfamiliar email address I did not recognize. I opened Marissa's message first. "Are you awake? Please tell me you did not keep texting him all night." I typed a quick reply saying I was fine and that nothing dramatic had happened. The group chat from work was just the usual Monday morning complaints about traffic and coffee. But the last notification held my attention longer. The email subject line was short. For Miss Hayes. A small crease formed between my eyebrows. I did not usually receive formal emails from strangers. Curious, I opened it. The message itself was brief. "Good morning, Miss Hayes. Mr. Cross asked that this be delivered to you today." Attached was a digital receipt and a note indicating that a package was scheduled to arrive at my address before noon. I sat up straighter on the couch, reading the message again to make sure I had not misunderstood it. A package. From Damien Cross. My heart began to beat a little faster. I scrolled down to the attached image. It was a receipt from a small boutique shop in the city. The item description was simple. Lipstick. The exact same shade I had been wearing in the bar the night before. I stared at the screen in disbelief. A second message appeared beneath the receipt. A short line typed at the bottom of the email. "Some things deserve to be remembered properly. Damien Cross." I leaned back slowly against the couch, staring at the morning light spilling across the apartment floor while a strange realization settled quietly in my mind. The conversation from last night had not ended at all. It had simply moved into the daylight. The email sat open on my phone while the quiet morning light filled the apartment, and for several seconds I simply stared at the words as if they might rearrange themselves into something more reasonable. A package scheduled to arrive before noon. Lipstick. The exact same shade I had worn the night before. Some things deserve to be remembered properly. Damien Cross. I set the phone down slowly on the kitchen counter and walked to the window, folding my arms as I looked out over the narrow street below. Morning traffic had begun to thicken, delivery vans parking along the curb, while people hurried toward the subway entrance at the corner. Everything outside looked ordinary. Predictable. Yet somewhere across the city a man I had spoken to for less than 10 minutes had already arranged for something to be delivered to my door. The thought sent a strange mixture of curiosity and unease through me. I tried to convince myself it was just an elaborate joke. Wealthy men probably made strange gestures all the time. Maybe this was simply his way of turning a ridiculous bar moment into a story he could laugh about later. But another part of my mind remembered the calm patience in his messages and the quiet certainty behind every sentence he had sent. This did not feel like a joke. Around 11:30, my phone buzzed again with a notification from the building intercom app that most tenants used for deliveries. Package for apartment 3B. The message was short and practical. A delivery driver was waiting downstairs. I stood still for a moment before grabbing my keys and walking out into the hallway. The stairwell smelled faintly of coffee and laundry detergent, the usual sense of a building waking up for the day. By the time I reached the front entrance, a man in a brown delivery jacket was already standing near the door, holding a small black box wrapped with a thin silver ribbon. "Lila Hayes?" he asked. I nodded slowly. "Signature here." He handed me a small electronic pad. I signed automatically, my mind still trying to process how something that had started with a 5-second dare had reached my doorstep less than 12 hours later. The driver gave a polite nod and left without another word. I stood there for a moment holding the box in both hands. It was surprisingly elegant, the kind of packaging you usually saw in expensive boutiques downtown. When I returned upstairs, I placed it carefully on the kitchen table and sat across from it like it might suddenly start explaining itself. The silver ribbon slid free with one gentle pull. Inside the box rested a slim lipstick tube in polished black metal. Beneath it was a small folded card. My fingers hesitated for a moment before opening it. The message inside was written in clean, precise handwriting. If a moment is going to follow you through the city, it should at least be remembered correctly. I looked down at the lipstick again, recognizing the exact color instantly. The same shade I had worn in the bar when everything started. My phone buzzed softly against the table before I could decide whether to laugh or be annoyed. A new message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "I hope the color is accurate." I exhaled slowly, leaning back in the chair as the realization settled over me again. Damian Cross had not forgotten the dare for even a single morning. My eyes stayed on the phone screen, while the small black lipstick tube rested on the kitchen table in front of me like a quiet reminder that the last 12 hours had not been ordinary. "I hope the color is accurate." The message looked almost casual, the kind of thing someone might text after sending flowers or coffee to a friend. But nothing about this situation felt casual. I picked up the lipstick slowly and turned it in my fingers. The metal case was cool and perfectly polished, reflecting the soft morning light that slipped through the kitchen window. When I twisted the base, the color rose into view exactly the way I remembered it from the night before. Deep rose with a hint of crimson. I let out a quiet breath and set it back down again. My phone buzzed lightly in my hand, as if reminding me that the conversation was still waiting. For a moment I considered ignoring the message entirely. That would probably be the sensible choice again. Accept the strange gift, put the lipstick in a drawer, and let the whole story fade into something I would laugh about months from now. But sensible decisions had already started to feel less predictable since the moment I walked across that bar floor. My fingers moved across the screen before I could change my mind. "It is the exact color." The response arrived quickly, almost like he had expected the answer. "Good." I leaned back in the chair, glancing once more at the small box on the table. The gesture still confused me. It was thoughtful in a strange way, but also precise, like he had wanted to recreate that brief moment with almost scientific accuracy. I typed another message. "You really did not have to send anything." The typing dots appeared again, then paused as if he was choosing his words carefully. When the reply came, it carried the same calm tone that had followed every message he had sent since last night. I did not send it because I had to. I sent it because details matter. I read the sentence twice, letting the meaning settle in my mind. Details matter. That sounded like the philosophy of someone who paid close attention to everything around him. The thought made me glance again at the lipstick, realizing how easily he had remembered something as small as a shade of color from across a crowded room. Another message appeared before I could respond. "Besides," he wrote, "it seemed unfair that a moment you started should only exist in memory." I smiled faintly despite myself. The logic was strangely charming in a quiet, deliberate way. Still, curiosity pushed another question forward before I could stop it. "Do you always follow up on dares like this?" The pause lasted longer this time. Long enough that I wondered if I had finally asked something he did not intend to answer. Then the screen lit again. "No, only the memorable ones." I shook my head lightly, a soft laugh escaping before I could stop it. Outside the window, the city continued moving through its usual morning rhythm, horns echoing faintly between buildings while sunlight reflected off glass towers in the distance. Everything about the day looked completely ordinary again. Yet a small black lipstick tube sat on my kitchen table like evidence that something unexpected had slipped quietly into my life. My phone buzzed one more time. One final message appeared beneath the others. And last night, Lila Hayes, was unusually memorable. I looked at the message for a long time before replying. And last night, Lila Hayes, was unusually memorable. The words sat quietly on the screen, simple and calm, yet somehow heavier than everything that had come before them. Outside the kitchen window, the city had fully woken up now. Sunlight bounced off the windows of the building across the street, and somewhere below a car horn echoed through the morning traffic. Ordinary sounds. Familiar sounds. But the small black lipstick tube still rested on the table in front of me like a piece of a story that had not finished unfolding yet. I picked it up again and turned it slowly between my fingers. The polished metal reflected my kitchen lights in thin silver lines. 12 hours ago, I had walked across a crowded bar floor on a ridiculous dare. 5 seconds later, I had kissed a stranger and returned to my friends laughing. At the time, it had felt like the kind of moment that disappears before the next song even starts. Yet here it was the next morning, sitting on my kitchen table in the shape of a carefully wrapped box and a conversation that refused to end. My phone remained quiet in my hand while I decided what to say. Part of me still wanted to step away from the entire situation, to treat it like a strange coincidence and return to the predictable rhythm of my normal life. But another part of me could not ignore the quiet curiosity that had been building since the moment he asked that first question in the bar. Finally, I typed slowly. Memorable is not exactly the word I would have used for it. The response came almost immediately. What word would you choose instead? I smiled faintly and looked out the window again. The city stretched in every direction beyond my building. A maze of streets and stories crossing paths every hour without anyone noticing. Somewhere inside that maze was Damian Cross, a man who sat calmly in dark corner booths and remembered the exact shade of lipstick a stranger wore for 5 seconds. I typed back. Unexpected. The typing dots appeared almost instantly. That is a fair description. I rested my elbow on the table and leaned my chin against my hand while I waited for the next message. It arrived a second later. Unexpected moments tend to change things. The words lingered in my mind for a second. Maybe he was right. Maybe most stories did not begin with careful planning or dramatic entrances. Maybe sometimes they started with a laugh, a dare, and a decision made in the space between two heartbeats. I typed one last message before I could overthink it. And what exactly do you think last night changed? This time the pause lasted longer. Long enough that I wondered if the conversation had finally reached its natural end. Then the phone buzzed softly in my hand again. I think, Lila Hayes, the message read, that depends entirely on what you decide to do next. I read the sentence twice while the quiet kitchen filled with sunlight around me. The lipstick still rested on the table, untouched, the same deep rose color that had started this entire strange chain of events. Outside the window, the city moved forward like it always did, unaware that somewhere in one small apartment, a simple dare had quietly turned into the beginning of something neither of us had expected.